there an idea how much is the cost so far that we've seen in Florida and St. Augustine?
No, I think that's going to take some time. I mean, I can tell you in our preparations with everything we did to prepare from the state, it was hundreds of millions of dollars.
We're about $300 million.
We did $300 million from the time that storm developed, and we said this is something last week that was going to be an issue, declared the state of emergency and got in. We were able to do that, and that has helped with the response tremendously. If you remember, I proposed a couple years ago, and the legislature did, to have a fund in state government for disaster response. And so we have $500 million that we earmark every year. And so this is the first time, unfortunately, we're having to tap it. But that money was there, ready to go. Now that FEMA, or now that the administration has given us the 30 days, a lot of that's going to be reimbursable. And so a lot of what the local governments have done in the local communities, those first 30 days will be 100% reimbursable by the federal government. And so that was similar to what's done in other hurricanes like Michael, and that'll make it did. The thing about this one is, sometimes you hear hurricanes and it'll hit like one place in one state. Well, in Florida, when they meander across a peninsula, you're hitting all these different communities, and there's a lot of impacts that have a trickle effect all across the state.
Governor, as you're moving around the state touring the damage, are there any locations that rescue crews still can't get to, and what kind of challenges are they facing to get in?
Would you say there's not any that they can't, or I mean,
right. It's complicated getting into Sanibel
yeah.
and Mars Beach, but we are starting an airlift bridge, an air bridge, and a barge bridge.
So right now, so for those of you not familiar with Southwest Florida, Sanibel Island and Captiva are connected to the mainland by a bridge, a causeway. That causeway was severed by the storm in a couple different places. So the only way to access that is either by sea or by air. And so what happened from the wee hours of the morning when the storm passed was bringing in Black Hawk helicopters, Chinook helicopters, finding people that wanted to be rescued and then bringing them safely back to the mainland. What they are also finding as they've gone in those areas is a lot of the residents are stabilized. They rode out the storm. Probably a very harrowing experience, but some of them have really nice homes and can do that. And so what they're finding now is a lot of them want to stay put on the island, and they're thanking the first responders for being there, but they are not asking to be rescued. Obviously, anyone in need of that, they are going to be willing to do that and bring back. But I would say the early hours, a lot of people just want to get off the island. Now more and more, they want to stay. The issue with this is going to be the transport back and forth to those islands. It's going to be good. We also have another island, great community, Pine Island. We were just at. That bridge got severed too. Now we will fix both of those bridges, but that doesn't happen overnight. I mean, there's a long process that goes on with that. So in the meantime, they are going to be running boats. They are going to obviously be doing air operations. I know Sanibel used to be an island that you had to ferry to anyways. We have some of those throughout the state of Florida. That's how they do it. But I think most people appreciate being able to drive back and forth. So we'll do that. But I think those island communities that were severed by the bridge were probably the most difficult to get to. And so you just had to use these resources. But that's part of the reason we had all these aircraft stationed. In the run up to the storm, we're saying, hey, we've got another 50 aircraft. Now we have 250 aircraft ready to go. FWC, National Guard, all these different task forces and everything. We have these the same guys that responded to the Surfside Tower collapse in South Florida. They were on Alligator Alley at midnight while the storm was still kicking so that they can get over there and help rescue people. So it's been a really Herculean effort. I think the issue is going to be who is going to want to stay there long term, knowing that the power situation is not great. They will fix it, but if they have to rewire the whole infrastructure, it's just going to take a little bit longer than if they just have to fix one utility pole. And then also the transport back and forth. I mean, some people like it that not as many people can come because they like being more tucked away. Others do not so much. The other thing that we're concerned about, particularly in those areas that were really hard hit, is we want to make sure we're maintaining law and order. Don't even think about looting. Don't even think about taking advantage of people in this vulnerable situation. And so local law enforcement is involved in in monitoring that. I told Kevin if the state needs to help as well, because you can have people bringing boats into some of these islands and trying to ransack people's homes. I can tell you, in the state of Florida, you never know what may be lurking behind somebody's home, and I would not want to chance that if I were you, given that we're a Second Amendment state.
Governor, thank you for coming down to St. Johns County. I want to ask you, and thank you for bringing FEMA with you. Now, we're seeing flooding that people are reporting similar to Hurricane Matthew out here in St. Johns County, and I know a lot of people felt it took a while to get FEMA relief last time at Hurricane Matthew. For the citizens of St. Johns County, what are we looking at? Can you give us any sort of timeline, or can the FEMA folks give us any sort of timeline on when people can start expecting that FEMA relief here in St. Johns?
So I'll let the administrator speak. I will just say, obviously, there's conversations about declaring this county available for individual assistance. That has not been done yet, so hopefully it will, and then at that point, the individuals will come and get assistance.
Yeah, so exactly. There's right now 13 counties that have been declared for individual assistance. They should register now for assistance. They can do that by going to disasterassistance.gov. They can call 1-800-621-3362, or they can use our FEMA app. Again, as I've been out here today with the governor, and we have teams all over the state doing assessments with the state to look at the damages in other counties, we will add more counties for assistance, and as soon as that happens, they can register for assistance. Some of the funding can go into their accounts sometimes right away for some initial needs that are met. Then we will send inspectors out to look at what the damages are. I think it's important to note, though, that FEMA does not replace insurance, so insurance is your first line that you need to go to, and then our funding can help jumpstart the rest of that recovery process. We're capped on statutorily for how much money that we can give for repair, but we also have the same amount of money that we can do for personal property belongings. And so we'll continue to work with each of the individuals, because we know that their cases are all unique, right? Every individual is going to have a different circumstance. It's going to be very unique and specific to them. And so we will have case managers that will help support that. And I believe when I was talking to Director Guthrie, already starting some of that case management process, because there's a lot of other funding sources that can come in and help.
And you now can do, and I didn't know this until the administrator told me, cleanup costs associated with flooding. When you have individual assistance, you can actually get money to help defray the cost of just cleaning up all the flood damage. And so that's obviously could be very expensive. I know a lot of people put elbow grease into it and really work hard on their property, but if you need someone to come in professionally, you now have access to some support for that.
Sir, when you get to places.
Oh yeah. And so we've been mentioning the way to, because people say, hey, how can we help? You see just in this community. I was talking with a couple down there. They evacuated, and when they came back, people were fixing their yard and doing stuff to help them out with their home. And so you have that spirit in these situations that are very difficult and obviously really life-changing in places that got hit so tremendously in Southwest Florida. But people step up and they want to help their fellow friends and neighbors. So we have a thing with Volunteer Florida, FloridaDisasterFund.org. This is purely tax-deductible, private donations for private groups to work with Volunteer Florida to help administer individual relief to people. And the thought behind it is FEMA has certain things they can do. They now can do this cleaning, for example. 10 years ago, they couldn't do it. So even if you wanted it, they could not do it. They have to follow whatever the rules are. Well, now this is a little bit more nimble. You can find unique needs for people, and we're not exactly sure what the medium and long-term needs are going to be for everybody because, we're not sure how many people are totally displaced. Those are a lot of seasonal homes there. There's a lot of rentals, and we don't know which homes are this or that. Well, we will find out as more people come for relief. So FloridaDisasterFund.org is way. I think they've raised $10-15 million already for that. And so that's going to be something that I think will help a lot of people, particularly those who are now without home.
Governor, as you've been able to get to places like Sanibel, Captiva, is there a way to put a number on the casualties, regrettably?
So they are doing those assessments. There have been casualties with the way they do it, and Kevin's explained it. There's a process where that's going. So if somebody drowns in their home because of flooding, that's going to be a confirmed storm-related casualty. obviously, unfortunately, people do pass away for other things. So sometimes there are deaths that are not attributable to the storm. Some may be indirect. Like, for example, in Charlotte County, they had somebody who, during the high tide of the storm, had a heart attack. He could not get emergency services because of what was going on. And so by the time the storm passed, it was too late. So that would be something that would be indirect. What I would tell you is, having looked at the damage in particularly Fort Myers Beach and some of those areas, some of those homes that are new construction actually stood, and sometimes you wouldn't even know that a storm hit it. But man, I'll tell you, those older homes that just aren't as strong built, they got washed into the sea, some of them. And so if you were hunkering down in that, that is something that I think would be very difficult to be survivable. And so they're still trying to figure out, okay, who was home, who wasn't. I will tell you, though, when they've gone to the Sanibel and these places, the people that did hunker down, and I just talked to the folks in Pine Island, they said the same thing. They said, by and large, life and limb, people did okay. It doesn't mean there's not going to be reported casualties, because there have been, and there will be. So it was a really significant storm. One of the things I think Kevin has done a good job of, and what I've tried to do, is point out how what the storm does directly is obviously very significant. But in these days after, there's deaths that happen in these storms. Down power lines, people using generators inside their homes, some of the flood, the standing water, some of the hazards that does. So please, just because the storm has passed, don't think that there aren't hazards there. Here, there's not as much standing water as in some of the places I saw in Central Florida. Fortunately, a lot of our power infrastructure seemed to hold up pretty well through most parts of the state, so that will mitigate some hazards. But at the end of the day, just please understand, and this is true for Michael, this is true for Irma, that in the week, 10 days after, we saw casualties because of what was happening, and we want to avoid those as much as we can.
Do you know what the impacts are on the anything that could or should have been done better to avoid those casualties? Should the evacuation order have been placed sooner?
Do you want to talk about how that happened?
So first of all, emergency management directors, sheriffs, police chiefs, fire chiefs make the best decision on the information they have at the time. This particular storm was going up and down the West Coast, moving inland out. I mean, at one point in time, we were looking at maybe an Apalachicola Bay storm all the way back to the Keys. The first thing that I would say to that is this was a very frustrating storm, trying to pinpoint where it was going to go. Lee County did not get real notice that they were going to be the center of this thing until about 36 to 48 hours. When that happened, they immediately called for the Cat A. They had a voluntary Cat A or evacuation zone A in place already for the storm surge when they were looking at 2 to 4 feet of storm surge. But then when it moved to a 12 to 18 foot of storm surge, they immediately called for mandatory evacuations. You may recall that the governor had said, if you're in a situation, you should evacuate. We can 100% guarantee you will not die from storm surge if you leave. We need people to heed warnings much more in the future and evacuate situations. That's the best way to save a life.
Well, and also, just so when we did our briefing 72 hours before the storm on Sunday, the National Hurricane Center had the storm hitting Taylor County in North Florida. Fort Myers and Naples were not even in the cone. And so it was a situation where those folks at the local level, as that storm started to shift, then they took that data and then they acted appropriately. But if you think, where was most of the media when the storm hit? They were not in Fort Myers. They were in Tampa. That's where they thought that the storm was going to hit. And obviously, those folks were under evacuation orders as well. So I think from Southwest Florida's perspective, as the storm shifted, they made calls and they were helping people get to shelters. They opened up their shelters. They did what they needed to do. I'll also point out there were a number of people who evacuated from Tampa to Fort Myers, thinking that the storm was going to go. So I think that those folks were looking at the data that they had, and as soon as they had data that they were going to be affected by this, and more than just a peripheral. I mean, 3 feet of storm surge is a big deal. I said even on Sunday, hey, just because it goes to Taylor County doesn't mean you're not going to get surge in Naples, and that's true. But there's a big difference between getting that and then getting the actual eye of the storm. And I would say, not only, I don't think they had even 48 hours. I think it was really as we were getting through the day on Tuesday when it really looked like they could get it. But even then, a lot of the impacts were projected to be Sarasota, Charlotte. Now, Lee would have had impacts from that, but even then they were not projected. So that storm kept moving further southeast as it was going compared to where the models are, and there's absolutely a difference. I mean, whoever was on that right side of that eye wall, Sanibel, Fort Myers Beach, those areas, that was the biggest wallop. If you were on the left side, there was damage, but it's noticeably different whether you're on that. And so these miles make a big difference in terms of how they do. But I can tell you, Kevin was working with all the local emergency managers ever since last week. And we said the whole time, we're like, everyone needs to be prepared. We don't know where it's going to go. You will lose power. You may be called upon to evacuate. You may have fuel interruptions, and so plan accordingly. And I think that they all did. I think that they took the information and they put it into practice. Okay, thanks everybody. Appreciate it. Which way? Thank you.